Things are smelling a little fishy these days as some of Canada's top officials have called for a deep government audit, especially after 3 important facts were revealed over the past week, leading to an unprecedented $3.4 billion expense increase. So today, why don't we talk about who exactly is calling for this audit, the 3 individual pieces of information that you need to know about, and how all of this could actually affect you directly. So let's get right into the information, and if you haven't already done so, make sure to subscribe to the channel, and if you want all of the sources that were used to make this video, you can check that out in the first link in the description. In a previous video, we talked about the links between government officials and certain consultancy firms, and I'll link that video right here. Those consultancy firms that have been hired across countless different government agencies, and the influence that these consultants have on future government policy, chiefly focusing on Canada's new immigration policy, targeting 500,000 new Canadians each year over the next 3 years. Now, this agency, previously led by Canada's former ambassador to China, got $66 million in contracts over the past 6 years, which is a 30x increase from their years prior. Reporting on this issue specifically got 2 individual opposition parties, the Conservatives and the Bloc Québécois, to join forces in calling for a deep government audit.
So we want to know what all this money was for. We also want to know about the outsized influence of this company in the operation of our government and our democracy. The company is under investigation for its involvement in politics and government in France. They've had to pay financial penalties for their role in facilitating the sale of opioids into the United States of America that helped deliver a massive drug overdose crisis that is now spread into Canada. And then finally, the director, former director of this company, managed to get himself the gig as our ambassador to China. So it's time for Canadians to get answers. We need to know what this money was for, what influence McKinsey has had in our government, and it is time for Canadian taxpayers to have answers to these questions.
Do you think there's something nefarious going on here, or do you just want to know what this money is going for?
Of course, I would say that I just want to know. We might have our suspicions, we might have discussions privately about what is this all about and this big thing and this book from the guys from the New York Times and all of that, but this is not our job. Our job is to make sure that we know as much as possible, and for each and every detail that we will not know, the population of both Quebec and Canada will have to ask questions to themselves. Why did we vote for this government? How could we get answer? How could things be done better? And basically, what I say is that this government cannot be left alone. It has to be under scrutiny all the time because they have some really bad habits.
First, we saw Pierre Poilievre, the leader of the Conservative Party, and then we saw Yves-François Blanchet, the leader of the Bloc Québécois, both calling for an audit of the government's outsourcing practices and these hefty millions of dollars spent on outside work contractors. And it makes a lot more sense why they're so outraged and why they're calling for this deep look into the government when you understand 3 important pieces of information. The first thing you need to understand is the rapid increase in government spending when it comes to hiring these outside consultants and outside contractors to do government work. And we can see that right here with this graph. This shows the government spending on outside contracts. And we can see that since 2015, that amount was at $8.4 billion spent per year. And now in 2020, we're seeing, the data as of 2020, this was at $11.8 billion, an increase of $3.4 billion over that period of time, especially impactful when you consider that back in 2009, the previous 16 years before 2015, we went from $8.1 billion to $8.4 billion in 2015, an increase of only $300 million. So we've definitely picked up the pace here. And this increase is likely very frustrating for a lot of Canadians, especially people who looked at the election campaign that was run by the Liberal government back in 2015 and what their views were on this very same practice that they've increased over their time in power. This is a section from the 2015 platform of the Liberal government, and this is a section called Tax Expenditures and Harper Spending Review. And if we scroll down here a little bit, we can see them talking about this very practice, saying that they want to reduce the use of external consultants consultants, bringing expenditures closer to 2005-2006 levels instead of what they were in 2015 of $8.4 billion. And here are a few examples of how this spending item has increased under Harper. They point at 3 ways that the previous Conservative government was spending too much on these outside consultants, adding together $140 million per year from one government agency, $188 million per year of an increase from another one, and $332 million per year from another one yet again, an increase of right around $500 to $600 million in terms of increases over that period of time, which is far less than the increases that we've seen today. So you might be saying, okay, a campaign promise broken, that's not the end of the world. I mean, we see every single politician from every single political party do that every once in a while. You might similarly come to the conclusion that it's normal for governments to hire businesses and individuals from outside of the government to help with tasks that they don't have the skills for, or for additional consultations. And you might look at this graph and say, okay, well, we do have an increase here, but when you look at the longer term trend line, maybe just the cost of government contracts goes up over time, and this is just like natural progression. But your opinion might be changed when you consider our second key piece of information, and that is the dramatic increase in hiring by the federal government of people to work within the federal government, a rapid increase in growth. Take a look at this chart directly from Canada's official website. This shows every year back to 2010, and it shows the population of the core public administration, in other words, the amount of people who work for the federal government at any given time. And we can see that in that same time period, when we saw the dramatic growth in outside workers hired by the government, consultants and contractors since 2015, we've also seen a dramatic growth in the amount of people that are working for the government directly, internally, an increase from 195,000 workers up to 254,000 workers as of 2022. This amounts to 60,000 additional workers hired by the government and paid by the government. And when we consider the years previous, between 2010 and 2015, we actually saw a reduction in the amount of people working for the government and being paid by the government of around, this looks like 20,000 people or so. I think it's probably starting to come together now in your mind. A 40% increase in government contracts over 5 years isn't entirely unreasonable in and of itself, though it is relatively high. But when you pair that with a simultaneous 30% increase in the amount of government employees, people hired to work directly within the government, well, then things start to get a little bit more questionable, right? And this isn't just frustrating for average Canadians, it's frustrating for the very federal workers that have been hired. The fact that there are outside consultants coming in to try to do their jobs. This is something that we covered in the previous video where we talked about this a little bit, but I think it adds a lot of insight here. This is from the department of the government that manages immigration policy and immigration services in Canada, and we talked about how McKinsey, a big consulting firm, hired a bunch of people to come in and try to sort of upgrade our processes within that government agency. But this is what the people who were actually hired and work internally in the government had to say about those external contracts, those external people that were hired to do, well, their jobs. They said, according to managers and politicians, everything that comes from outside is always better, even if we had enough resources internally, said one department source. McKinsey always says that they have great expertise, but it doesn't make sense because we have expertise and we're completely pushed aside. And they're sort of displaying this sentiment that, hey, we have the resources within the government to do these jobs, but at the same time, we're hiring and outsourcing more contract work to these large consultancy agencies.
We think that when you have qualified public servants to do the job, we shouldn't be contracting the same work out to high-priced consultants who charge much more. These consultants can charge hundreds of dollars an hour. By contracting everything out, you end up paying more. And so we would like, as Conservatives, we intend to bring more of that work in-house and use the expertise that our public servants have. What the reporting on the McKinsey controversy showed over the last several days is that the public servants believe that they could have done the job themselves. And then they had these aliens from outer space coming in and presenting them with a bunch of PowerPoint presentations and fancy charts and graphs that produced no value and interrupted the work of our core public service. I think we need less of these PowerPoint presentations and more actual work and delivery of service to the people on the ground.
All of this is amplified by the recent increase in concerns over the manner in which these contracts have been awarded as of recently, bringing us to our third important piece of information that you need to understand, that there has been a general lack of transparency in the way that these government contracts are handled. Now, I could talk about examples from other areas of government, but I want to tie this to a contract that you might have already heard of, and that is the ArriveCAN application, the application that was developed to help with COVID border crossing in Canada that the government paid $55 million to outside contractors to develop just over the past 2 years. Now that is a rather high number, $55 million, but we're not even going to talk about the amount on this contract. Instead, I think it's far more interesting to look at how some of the people who are listed as being paid some of that $55 million claim that they never actually worked on the project. Here's a list of how much the government paid for all of these contracts that were used to develop this ArriveCAN application. We're going to talk about GC Strategies in a little bit more detail in just a moment, because the $9 million that they paid was actually rather interesting. Just 1 second on that though. What I want to talk about here is Think On Inc., which was paid $1.18 million. And recently the CEO came out and said, hey, I'm surprised to see my company on this list because we actually didn't have anything to do with this. This Globe and Mail article says that the CEO of Think On Inc. says he has no idea why his company was listed as having received a $1.2 million ArriveCAN contract and is calling on the CBSA to issue a correction. The CBSA, of course, Canada Border Services Agency, the agency that signed on all of these contracts because they're obviously managing the border, and that's what the app was for. Now, this piece of information came out just before the House of Commons Committee on Government Operations was set to talk to various witnesses about the developing of the ArriveCAN application, to which they didn't really get an answer as to why Think On was included in this list, but they did get some very very interesting information about that first firm, the one that was paid $9 million, GC Strategies.
To GC Strategies, Mr. Firth, how many employees do you have?
We have 2 employees, myself and my business partner.
Okay. Without getting into your detailed CV, are you programmers or app designers yourselves?
Absolutely not. We are IT recruiters. We cut our teeth in the industry working for large staffing firms.
Okay.
And we decided to go out by ourselves.
So in this context, your work for the government of Canada, you're the broker, the middleman between the government and the service provider. Is that correct?
Essentially, yeah. They would come to us with the requirements they ask for, and we facilitate that.
What is the commission for that intermediary, that middleman role? We're led to understand that it's 30%.
That would be at the very top end. Industry standards are anywhere from 15 to 30, depending on the skill set, the type of resource that is required.
Now, there were some rather revealing things about GC Strategies in that clip, and if you followed along, you would have understood that GC Strategies is only a company of 2 people, and they got paid $9 million. The way that they actually operate is that they would get the government contract, and then they sort of subcontract out all of the work for it and take a hefty commission. To give you a better understanding, I've made this sort of graph here, and I think that it'll make things a lot more clearer as to how this all works. GC Strategies has a relationship with the government, at the very least, that the government trusts them to do this type of work, and they get this contract for $9 million to develop the ArriveCAN app, but they actually don't know how to develop apps at all, and instead they have knowledge of a bunch of other people that do have that knowledge, and they can assemble a team to work on that contract, so they might subcontract out this contract and pay a bunch of different subcontractors a portion of that $9 million, maybe to build out the front-end application for the website, building out the mobile app, building out the back end, and then maybe another subcontractor to integrate this application with all of the very antiquated systems that CBSA might be using. And for putting together this team of subcontractors, GC Strategy says they take anywhere between 15 to 30% of the contract's value. At 15% as a sort of commission here for putting together the team, GC Strategies would get paid $1.35 million on the low end, and on the high end it would be double that, $2.7 million for putting together this team. And remember, this is $2.7 million to GC Strategies, a company of only 2 people. And this isn't an entirely uncommon practice in many different businesses. You can think about an area that I'm experienced in, real estate and sort of building properties or developing properties. You look at the typical idea of a general contractor who you would hire to manage the job site, and they get hired and get paid a set amount, and then from their earnings they pay out subcontractors, maybe someone to do the tiling, someone to do all the drywalling, a plumber, right? You hire a general contractor to hire subcontractors so that you don't have to deal with putting together the team. But the lack of transparency as to who these subcontractors were and what they were actually doing, along with Think On, that company that was listed that actually claimed that they didn't get paid for this ArriveCAN app, well, it made this parliamentary committee a little bit concerned, and they requested additional documents from the Canada Border Services Agency, the CBSA, so they can get a little bit more clarity around this. Again, the Globe and Mail reports that since then, the CBSA has been sending documents to the committee in small batches. The most recent package of invoices was released last month. Along with that package, the CBSA president said to the committee that the agency will not be revealing the identities of the subcontractors involved, and they also will not be revealing how much people were paid, the rate, the hourly rate, or even the purposes of those individual contracts. They say this is because of industry privacy and not wanting to reveal these names for their own privacy, but you got to be a little bit concerned when they're not going to tell us who the contract was given to, what the contract was for, what the contract amount was, and how they actually sourced that contract. It gets a little bit suspicious, right? Now, this lack of transparency from the CBSA has led people to question if there is this big inquiry into the other government contracting, would they even get any additional details, or would it all be highly redacted with the purpose and the amount that they're being paid and who's being paid all eliminated from those documents, even if they were to get them? And this is something that both of these individual political leaders was questioned on. That are you even going to get any information if you launch this inquiry?
They're not getting
Right.
the identities of the subcontractors. So you're starting this whole process again, slightly different topic, but why, what's your response to how they reacted to the October one, and how do you think this is going to be any different?
That's a good question, and Conservatives are going to work hard to hold the government accountable. We're going to team up with opposition parties who have a combined majority on that committee to force the government to release the information both on ArriveCAN contractors and on McKinsey. Canadians deserve answers and how their dollars are spent, and we'll make sure they get those answers.
So how do you respond when you make these requests and you get no responses?
If you suggest that I could change what the system is in order to make it better, I would be very happy to do so. It would start with independence of Quebec. But in the meantime, we have to live with the institutions as they are. This is a minority government which behaves like a majority government because it has some kind of a weird deal with another party. And because of that, they just don't answer questions. They do things discreetly. They subcontract some of the very basic functions and roles and obligations and responsibilities of the states to a huge private society who does not provide public services. It does provide profits to its shareholders. And this is a very important question.
So at the end there, you hear the leader of the Bloc Québécois saying, hey, well, even if we aren't going to get all the documents back, we have to keep trying. We have to work within the system that we currently are. And he does mention the connection between the NDPs and the Liberals and how that might make it more challenging for the government to be questioned on these types of things. If you don't remember, the NDP signed a supply and confidence agreement with the Liberal government, and that essentially means that the NDP has a list of tasks and things that they want the Liberal government to do, and as long as the Liberal government does that, the NDP promises not to vote against them in any major vote in the House of Commons that could potentially trigger an election. And that segues perfectly into how all of this could affect you, apart from the obvious that these are tax dollars that are collected from average Canadians and people are questioning where these dollars are going. On top of all of that, this could be something that is a major political sort of wedge point over the next little while because the NDP are going to be forced to sort of take a side on this issue. Do you go with the Liberal government that you've been supporting for a while because of your supply and confidence agreement, or do you finally sort of take a stand against them because it wouldn't look good to NDP supporters if they were in favor of all of these extremely expensive government contracts not being sort of accounted for properly? So it's actually an interesting political move from the Bloc and the Conservatives to sort of force the NDP to take a side, and I think it's likely that they're going to be not happy with the way that the Liberal government has been handling things, so that could change the political landscape over the next little while. But we've covered so much in this video, and I'm curious what you think about all of this. Do you think that we need to look farther into these things, or do you think it's kind of just more standard government practice and we should be okay with it? Either way, let me know down in the comments what you think. I read every single one and try to get back to as many as I possibly can. And while you're down there, make sure to subscribe to the channel if you haven't already done so, to keep on getting these Canadian-focused financial updates. And if you want, again, all of the sources that were made, that were used to make this video, you can click the first link in there, and I send out a weekly update with all of the sources for all of the videos posted on this channel on Sundays. So you can check that out. But with all of that said, thanks so much for watching, everybody. Really hope this video helped you out at least a little bit, and I'll see you next time.